Good evening or good morning and hello. Thanks for joining us for this live recording. Um, we are Barnform Publishing. We're an independent publisher, mainly around military history, and particularly quite a lot of stuff around the kind of Zulu Wars and that sort of thing. So we've got an expert here tonight to guide us through all things kind of South African history. Um, Barnthorne are open to first-time authors. Most of our authors are, in fact, first-timers. But the likes of Cam here, very experienced authors in their own rights, and we're proud to have a mix of the two. So if you've got an idea, whether you're a new author or an old author as such, drop us a message on our social media or at submissions@barnformpublishing.co.uk. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Cam Simpson. Cam, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yep. Hi, Ashley. Hi, Neil. Yeah, okay. So you can tell by my accent, I'm an Australian, but I've lived all around the world, really. Um, I was in the Australian Army, then I was over in the British Army, back to the Australian Army, and all during this time, I was always picking up books and really getting into history. I mean, it was when I was in the UK, I was forever in the archives in out of Kew. I suppose over the years, I've always found myself pre-digital age, in particular, writing down notes on people, soldiers, any little bit of information extra that I could find about them. I was always sort of recording it in notebooks and on cards. And that sort of really pushed me into looking towards producing a book. And especially a pre-digital age, it was quite challenging collecting information on soldiers when files were not available for them. The first book I did was on the 8th Light Horse Regiment. It was a biographical book, and that was actually centered around some pay cards that were available through the archives in Melbourne. It was unique to that state, but it provided all the promotion dates, etc. So each one of these little pay cards was a potted history. So I researched around that. And no sooner I got that out, then sort of like the internet hit us and things that opened up a little bit more. Yeah, but so I've worked in the security industry in Africa and the Middle East. Was Cape Town based for pretty much 10 years, really. During that time, and that leads us into this book. I was forever in the Cape Archives, a little bit up in Pretoria, and sometimes in Pietermaritzburg as well. But in the Cape Archives, I was really having a lot of good fun in there, uh, digging out loads of files. And sometimes I said you're the first person that's ever accessed this, and that's how I came across this book on General Brabant or Brabant. People would more commonly say. And here we are today, I suppose.
Well, you've definitely you've got the bug, some would say, wouldn't you? Your this is your eighth book now, so can you believe it? They must have flown by.
Oh yeah, yeah, they have for sure. It's just amazing, and there's always something on the boil. I've got multiple subjects that are going from Moorosi's Mountain Gun War. We'll talk about them later on, but there's always a stack of books that I'm working on, and one that I couldn't finish until I got up to the Zimbabwe archive. So I did that just before we left South Africa. So I got up and did a good 3 days in the archives there. That's all they'll give you up there, actually. 3 day bursts in the archives, but three fantastic days, I've got to say that. Really enjoyed it.
And I guess like as that journey's gone on for you as a writer, how have you found it? Have you found it getting easier? Like have you changed your kind of methods, etc. How you go about it, the process?
Yeah, yeah, I suppose I have changed it. Yeah, some of the books that I've got, the drafts I've got out, I've got the chapters already fleshed out, and some of them are going to be hard slogs research wise.
Hmm.
You end up with some real gaps and voids, especially in that one I've got on Moorosi's Mountain that I know you guys already had a look at an early draft. There were a couple of gaps in that I've had to work on, but yeah, being able to get into the archives when I was in South Africa, it was just literally down the road. Um, so I could be there in 5 minutes. It was quite handy, but it was just down a real a lot of hard graph really and a lot of page turning. Um, and I found the books just seem to open up and write themselves,
Mm.
as you're finding information. I've just got these open palettes basically, the documents are up and running. One thing that's greatly helped me though, as a researcher of people, and it's quite nerdy this, but especially I was heavily into first Anglo-Boer War and then right back to Ninth Frontier War. I kept an A to Z sort of record of every colonial that I could come across, and it links to them, etc. So, but one of those documents is 6,000 pages long. It's it's my go-to of, right, what have I got on this guy? Little tidbits and stuff I just throw in. I just say to myself, see this book, see that. And I've really disciplined myself to keeping that thing going. I'm into it every day. And that provides me quite a good sort of palette of information, and so when I was putting the footnotes together for this book, I already had quite a lot of them already penned out. There's a lot of imperials in there as well. So yeah, it's quite a bit of a nerdy habit, but that's greatly helped me actually. And as at the moment, time, I haven't got as much time as what I used to. It's funny as you get older, you seem to get busier for some reason. Um, but but I look at that and I think, wow, that's a lot of books for years to come. And one day I'm going to have to find a place to deposit that because it's a valuable source in itself.
Definitely. Well,
It's,
there's still a lot of writing to be had before then. Um,
yeah, for sure.
so taking us back to Frontier Warrior then. So you mentioned that while you were, on one of your research expeditions, you came across something, and that is basically the backbone of this book. So would you like to introduce that and how you came across it and where that took us?
Yeah, no problems actually. Yeah, so as I was putting together material for my book on Moorosi's Mountain and the Basuto Gun War, I was going through every document that I could find in the Cape archives. I'd sort of go through my methodology is to go through a packing list, regardless of what the title is. Because every now and then something on telegrams, um, Prime Minister to, it's a pretty bland sort of title, and I'd just get in there and you'd always find gold. I always say, right, I'm off to the archives prospecting today. And so I'd be open up box after box in order, and I'd sort of do a bit of a catalogue. And I knew that there was a records there on General Brabant, and I thought I'll get into that one day and in the order that I was moving, because I was really interested to see what records were there, and I was really surprised to see this unpublished manuscript that was typed up, and it was in 1902 that he pulled it together. Late '02 that I suppose he started to put it together. And I realized that it was an amazing account, not just of the period I was looking at for Moorosi's and the gun war, but his entire life. Um, Really, it saved the last 10 years, because he died in 1914. And I realized that, from a South African literature perspective as well, that it was a valuable and it's a missing resource. And I mean, it really needs to be out there. So I had a loose discussion with the Cape Archives about publishing it. And they said, yep, no worries, just fill in these forms and send it in. And then I got a little bit more serious after I had it typed out. Um, and and I was in this thing all the time. I thought, right, I'm going to get around to doing this one day. And it was really when I got to the end of my Moorosi mountain research that I realized that this actually has to happen. He's quite a special character and very humble in the way that he writes at times, very honest. There's times when things always don't go well for him in his soldiering career, and he puts his hand up to it. And there's great little tidbits about people as well that he meets, and that's the other thing with him. These military generations, as I call it. I mean, his father was a Napoleonic War veteran, and he knew many. And when he first joins the militia, he's surrounded by men that are fresh out of the Crimea, like that very year. So when he knew people of that generation, and he influenced people that were still soldiering in the Second World War.
Hmm.
So when you look at it, that period of time, and when when I first joined the army, Vietnam veterans were young. When I was in artillery when I first joined, and my first gun bombardier was a Vietnam veteran. So it's so you look at the period that you're covering, and that's quite unique. I think when you look at the way that he's recorded his recollections of these people, so it's quite special.
Yeah, and I guess I mean of the way the memoirs that the book is structured, it's obviously chronological, so it takes you through, a series of these, massive events in not only his life, but obviously in world history, um, local history. So um, we're going to obviously talk through some of the kind of the key, conflicts and wars that he took part in. But I guess maybe talk us through kind of his early life through to, you know, uh, you know, into the military, etc. That kind of early military career.
Yeah. Okay. So as I said, he soldiered for many years. I mean, his entire military career spanned over 47 years, in and out of it. So he was born in Cheshire, um, and he entered the militia in 1855. So during that period, he really wanted to be a soldier. His father ended up in the debtors' prison for a period, and he said like buying a commission at that stage eluded him, but they managed to get him into the militia, and he was in it for about a year, and he was only 15 when he first joined, but he was still really wanting to get away into the regular army, and in the end, he managed to get himself a commission in the Cape Mounted Rifles, which he purchased that commission. So it's amazing that the family scraped together and got the money together for it, but they did. Back in those days, the Cape Mounted Rifles was an imperial regiment, so their depot was in Canterbury. And so he joins them in 1856, and he's 16 at the time. He's very, very young kid, really. And he stays with them until they're disbanded in 1870. And he, during that period, he he managed to secure the temporary appointment as paymaster. So they thought he was quite a responsible character, knew his way around some numbers, of course. You wouldn't want to be getting the pay wrong for 600 pretty hard and tough sort of soldiers on the frontier of South Africa. And then he also the acting position of adjutant, which he held for a number of years as well. And so this obviously brings him out to South Africa, and the earlier parts of his soldiering career. And as we sort of talk about the chapters, I can flesh him out a little bit further in there. But that's how it gets him out to South Africa. And then he decides when the frontier, the Cape Mounted Rifles is disbanded, he's at a bit of a loose end. They throw him on half pay, and he's bumped up to captain at this stage. and he decides he's going to stay out in South Africa, and he sets up a farm at Ganubi Park, which is about 10 miles out of East London on the coast there in the Eastern Cape. And he's reasonably successful as a local farmer, and he's still sitting on this half pay though.
Hmm.
In 1873, he bumps into Gordon Sprigg, who was a local member for East London, and he persuades him to run as a second member for East London, and he enters politics, and he moves into it pretty quickly. Actually, I think from memory in his account, it's almost unopposed, and he just walks into it, and he's a great character in the community and highly respected. And a lot of the colonists there know him of his time in the CMR because he was based all over the place. And those early days, mind you, they as in the CMR were not easy. At one stage in his account, at one of the posts, they're almost starving. So he had to get a vegetable patch going, and I think one guy dies of scurvy of all things, And it's amazing. That period. It was pretty tough for him. So he had a good reputation, and it's then that he raises what was known as Number One Company of the Buffalo Volunteer Rifles in 1876, just before the Ninth Frontier War. So yeah, so that's his earlier part of his life. Quite humble beginnings, really, considering the end of Major General.
Yeah, I was going to say the pace kind of soon picks up, doesn't it? Really from there, he has moved around and he's already found himself both in military life and political life, and that's something we'll kind of return back to later on how he
Yeah.
kind of goes back into the political landscape. Um, so yeah, you mentioned obviously the Ninth Frontier War and the Moorosi Rebellion. So what's his role in those?
Yeah, so as we just said, he's raised the not this Number One Company of the Buffalo Volunteer Rifles, and back in those days, although he was a captain in the on the half pay list, in actual fact, I'll just backtrack a bit. He he's taken from half pay, and he's on the staff at that stage, and they throw him into the 80th Regiment. It was based over in Hong Kong, and 80th, sorry, it was the 80th. And he's got no desire to leave his farm and get posted to Hong Kong. So he sells his commission, and that's it. He's gone in 75. And then, so at the time when the Buffalo Volunteer Rifles has been formed, he is a local member. But back in those days, the officers are all elected. And this was common practice right throughout the Capes, all these little volunteer regiments. The officers were all elected. And so he secures a position as captain and commanding officer. So you had to be highly respected to get a berth. And in particular, as the wars are actually in flow and they raise regiments, not only you got to be a good guy and a good leader, but the men have got to have confidence you're going to get them out of this war in all in one piece as such. So they thought a lot of him. So the Ninth Frontier War um, breaks out. It was known as the Wedding Feast War. It came about by a brawl with some Fengu and Galika at a wedding there on the outskirts of the Fingu Reserve, and the Frontier Armed Mounted Police was sent in to keep an eye on the area, but things really start to get out of hands. There's raiding, Galika raiding the Fengu, who'd been the Fengu, mind you, had been very loyal to the Crown for many years. And they'd been placed in this reserve, and they were highly thought of, and they're a very industrious bunch. And there was counter raiding, and then things really sort of snowballed, and then there was a fight with the Frontier Armed Mounted Police, and pretty soon after the Cape government mobilised the volunteers, of which the Buffalo Volunteer Rifles was mobilised in late September 1877. And so Brabant gets all his guys together at the same time. He's appointed what they call the Burgher Commandant for East London. I think there was two of them down there at that stage, and he's one of them. So he's like a commandant of his district. And at that time, they were doing a lot of patrolling. They were making sure that the area sort of east of the Key River, there was no outbreak of rebellion. And he's involved with these earlier operations against the Galika, and then he receives a mention in dispatches for leading a column in December 1877. So this is all pretty fast moving at that stage. Up around the area by Beaker, there'd been a lot of fighting up around that in that area that he wasn't involved with. So geographically speaking, that's from where he is down in East London. It's sort of like northwest really from where he is. And then the war moves. It takes them over into the Ciskei area, the Perry Bush and the Amatola Mountains. And this is when the imperial governments really got involved. That the Cape government believed that they did a pretty good job of clearing the Galika, but in actual fact, they hadn't cleared them. They'd just moved away and they'd secured their area in safer locations, and then they came back into the fight again. But things after the Battle of Sentani, when the imperial government had got involved, and this is when the 24th Foot were first operating in the Transkei area. At Sentani, that battle's fought out, and that sort of closes the fighting in that Transkei area out. And so they're moving down to the south in this Perry Bush area, not too far away. And at this stage, he raises a new unit. So the Buffalo Volunteer Rifles aren't involved with this, but they stand down, although the men all return to their day jobs, whether it's in East London in the town or their farms. But he raises what's known as the frontier mounted rifles at that stage, and he takes them as their commanding officer. He's elected once again down to the Amatola Mountains, and this is when Thesiger, who later becomes Lord Chelmsford, he starts a series of drives down in the Amatola Mountains to basically bring a close to the war. As Chief Sandeli's down there with his Nikwa tribe. Also, remnants of the Galika are also down in that area, and they get a series of drives going, and Brabant's given a column. Fluctuates from anything up to about 280 to 400 men. So it's not a massive column, but the first drive is a bit of a disaster. And the blame was actually put on Brabant himself. And so they went out and they were doing like a driving move, and drive and a cordon is the best way to describe it. And everybody had to be in position and setting off basically at first light. He'd got out with his column quite earlier into position, is in the Bailey's Grave area, and they could see some cattle in front of them. Now, part of the terms and conditions for serving in those days would, you'll get a couple of shillings a day, but you'll also get a share of the loot from the cattle, that livestock that's impounded. And it was a term and condition in those days. And there was actually an officer that would be appointed to divvy up all the shares in this, so that they could see a bit of cattle down below them. And he thought, okay, there's no harm in going down and grabbing that cattle while you could. And even in the Zulu War, a couple of years later, this whole thing about impounding cattle. I mean, the Frontier Light Horse, I mean, they had a conveyor belt of this stuff going back down south from up, it was one officer in particular, and it was an Australian actually, Barry by the name. He was continually moving cattle from around the Kambula camp all the way down to Peter Maritzburg, etc. So they felt that it was also um, taking away the focus of what they should be doing in the field, but at the same time, that is the economy of the tribe, so it's taking away great wealth from them as well. Anyway, so these guys went forward, and when they got down there, it wasn't just a handful of rebels herding their cattle. That was a bit of a hornet's nest that they went into, and so prematurely the the attack was sprung, and Commandant Stretfield, he wrote a couple of books himself on the subject, had to come to his rescue. And Brabant, his own words, said, I was greatly blamed at the time for this, as it was like really making a mess of this first drive. And not to be detracted though, by this event. I mean, he does really well on the next couple of drives, and he walks out with a companion of Sir Michael and St George and another mention in dispatches from it. Even Stretfield does go on to say that he Brabant did really well, but he was working hard to sort of redeem himself, and but he's, as I said in his writings, he's very humble guy, and when he's writing though, he owns up to a lot of things, and we'll talk a little about them later on, and that especially in the Moorosi Mountain campaign. But he says, I still really can't see what I really did wrong then. He said, no matter what happened, we were still going to bump into these guys because it was his axis of advance. So that fight was coming. The fact that he prematurely launched it, but it was just really just sending a few guys down to grab some cattle. But yeah, so the frontier mounted rifles was sort of like his brainchild to raise that. And it's interesting that out of that unit, when it was disbanded, there's a number of men that went on to serve in the Zulu War. In the Natal Matter Police, I know my research there that there was Trooper Pierce Nagel was a sergeant major in the troop sergeant major in the Frontier Mounted Rifles. Sydney Hunter, I know Neil would be interested in this, of Rorke's Drift fame. He was a Frontier Mounted Rifles chap, and William Doorhill was as well. And then there's no fewer than 12 Natal Native contingent officers had served in the Frontier Mounted Rifles with Brabant as well. So you can see at this stage that these military generations, the next generation, he's having a little bit of an influence on. So it would seem by 12 men being commissioned from the FMR into the NNC is quite a good endorsement of what the skills that they thought of Brabant at the time. That his testimonials, because these men would have all provided testimonials when they're joining these regiments, of which a lot of these testimonials still survive in the Cape Archives. So it's their application to join a regiment, and then you'll get a whole lineup of testimonials that saying, yeah, he served with me, he's a good guy. And sometimes you might get a little bit more detail. Did you want me to get into Moorosi's Mountain?
Yeah, I think so. So just timeline wise, what year are we up to now with
So
Moorosi?
the Ninth Frontier War finished in June 78. So he formed this Frontier Mounted Rifles in early March. So they're only in the field a couple of months. So the Ninth Frontier War in its entirety is a pretty small affair. But what it really fleshes out, in some respects, I look at this as a a rehearsal for the Zulu War, especially for the imperial government. So they've got a string of regiments spread out along the eastern Cape frontier in small garrisons and forts at this stage, just in case rebellion breaks out again with other tribes, the Pondamisi, for example, the Tembu again. And the Cape government, and their lessons learned from the Frontier War, they realised that they're just not prepared at all. Um, they did the best they could. Um, then Gordon Sprigg, who's the new premier of the Cape. So in the Ninth Frontier War, the Sir Bartle Frere had come in at that stage just before the Frontier War, and he sacked the Molteno ministry at that stage. So he sacks the Prime Minister, and then he gets Gordon Sprigg in. Gordon Sprigg's he's a Scottish chap, and he's really pro-federation at that stage. So he's following that vein of, yep, we need to federate all the Natal, the Free State, and the Transvaal. We need to pull them all together over a period of time. And so Sprigg he conceives this idea that all these small volunteer units right throughout the Cape Colony are great to an extent, but on the frontier itself, where rebellion could still break out, he decides that they should pull together a lot of these units, disband them, and throw them into a bucket that became known as the Cape Mounted Yeomanry. And they raised three of these regiments, of which they were supposed to be about 1,000 in strength, and they just never got there. So this is the 5th of August, 1878, that Brabant's appointed as the Carter staff for this the first regiment he's given command of. So the permanent establishment was him. He had a chap by name of Dalgetty as his adjutant, and Dalgetty, who's an imperial officer and then later become a big deal in the Cape Mounted Rifles. He's the adjutant. He has a sergeant major, a staff sergeant major, and that's the permanent staff to pull this together. So this is in August 1878, and the second and third regiments are also being pulled together at the time. He's got his headquarters at King Williamstown. They had no uniforms at that stage. So men were parading dressed in former uniforms that they had of their old volunteer unit, then in mufti with bandoliers thrown over their shoulder, and that they looked like a bunch of pirates at this stage. And training as a regiment had never actually occurred at this stage. And then, so this is August. So Bartle Frere's got his eyes on Zululand at this stage, and they start to move the imperial units out of the frontier. At which stage they mobilise the Cape Mounted Yeomanry, and there's a bit of a vacuum and a knock-on effect. So as regiments are moved out of the Transkei area and they're up into Natal, poised ready for the Zulu War, you've got the mobilisation of the three yeomanry regiments and other regiments, and even down in Cape Town, you've got elements of the 4th Foot were pulled away. Units were mobilised locally in Cape Town to take on the garrison of the Cape Castle, etc. So it's a knock-on effect all the way from Cape Town, and some units even do mobilise and they come up. The Dukes, for instance, the Duke of Edinburgh's own Volunteer Rifles, they come up and they take on a garrisoning job in the Transkei as well. At that stage, they come all the way from Cape Town. So all of a sudden, Brabant's faced with this. Not only has he got a unit that's probably about 300 to 350 men strong at that stage that hadn't trained together. They're poorly equipped, but he's got to mobilise them and get them out into the frontier. So they're initially sent to Tembuland. Now, parallel to this, when all the eyes are on how Zulu War was going to play out, what's going to happen there, everybody obviously knows that it's going to go down. They've also, a few men from the CMR have managed to secure positions in the Natal Native contingent, and they've taken leave, which they could do. It's considered for the greater good. So the yeomanry lose some good men at that stage, in particular the second regiment, and those guys have gone off to Natal. But up in southern Basuto land, the right down in the south west pocket there, there's a chief by the name of Moorosi of the Baputhi, who he was getting on a bit. He's like in his 70s at that stage. And he's a great fighter and character in his own right, a real personality. Somebody had called him at one stage a firebrand, and others had said he's an amazing and skilled fighter, a cattle raider, and he'd fought all the way back to the period of the Mfakana when Shaka was encroaching in the area. So he fought Zulus at that stage, and he came under Masheshwe, the great paramount ruler of the Basuto. He'd fallen under him, and they were very good friends, and they'd fought with each other on many occasions. So this character's down in the in southern Basuto land. He's got something like 70 odd daughters and just a never ending line of sons. When I was writing the Moorosi book, they were writing up and say, well, one of Moorosi's sons has been killed or wounded or raided. And it's just another son. It's just like a never ending line of them, this incredible family lineage. But one of his sons, Dodo, had been arrested for cattle raiding, which at the time was just a way of life. That's how the Baputhi, they accumulated their wealth, as did the Basuto. They raided up into the Free State, and farmers were always having their cattle nicked. And this was a never ending problem. And Doda's locked up in a prison, and he's busted out, and the Cape government so we'll get to hand him over, and who's a Moorosi, refuses to do this, and they then start to move up elements of the second and third yeomanry to show a force on the border. And pretty soon there's a fight between the second yeomanry elements of the Cape Mounted Rifles at Parmeet Fontaine, just on the border of Basuto land and the Cape there. And then that's the start of the Moorosi rebellion. Then the Cape government obviously can't have this. And this is all parallel to the Zulu War. So this is February 1879. So Isandlwana has just happened. So Moorosi, he knew of Isandlwana before they knew of it in Cape Town. News just travelled from mountaintop to mountaintop. And he decides, well, he's going to make a stand. Also, at this time, they're trying to take the weapons off them as well. So Wolseley, he even wrote at the time when he heard of what the Cape government was doing and the way that they were handling the Baputhi, he thought it was crazy to actually embark on a campaign in southern Basuto land, but they did, and it runs until November of 1879. So Brabant's part in this. Remember how he's already mobilised his unit, so they patrol the Drakensberg Mountains on the southern face, Basuto lands north of them, and they're trying to stop any of the Baputhi moving in and out with cattle into what was known as Moorosi's territory. Then Commandant Griffith, who enters Moorosi's country, besieges Moorosi's mountain. And Moorosi's mountain visually to describe it. It's an amazing place to visit. Um, it's very, very peaceful down there. It's got a bit of a spiritual feel about it. It just feels different. There's something about this place that's got a real draw to it. Um, but the best way to describe it's probably 4 or 5 times the size of Isandlwana. Um, Similar in geography itself. So they find that Moorosi's um, fortified that mountain so much so that later some Royal Engineers come up from Cape Town and they say there's nothing we can do. It's just too well fortified, and it's tiers of walls that are really well constructed. And he out-engineered the engineers. I mean, he's quite incredible. But this is the way that they fought. The Baputhi and the Basuto they studied techniques. They'd fortified mountaintops before. They even called their where other tribes would be their regiments would be sometimes referred to as moving as impies. They referred to them as commandos because they are nearly always mounted. Um, and so, but up on the mountain, he's got several hundred men, and this mountain's in a state of siege. Commandant Griffith takes it on with an attack in April, and it's a failure. They, despite every effort to take it, they could not break into these defensive walls. This first tier of wall it sits on a stone shelf, and that's still there, of course. And so they're about 9 to 12 foot height, and they get up to this wall, and they're legging each other up. They're loophole walls, so the Baputhi are firing through that, and they're also plunging their assegai through. And it's during that fight, in actual fact, that Sergeant Scott and Peter Brown are subsequently awarded the Victoria Cross for their bravery that day. Then they decide to move Brabant up. And so Brabant crosses through the Drakensberg. The description in the book's amazing. Like he's really taken by the terrain as they're moving into Moorosi's country. And at some stage, it's like a bridle tracks they're moving down, and one step to the right means you're going to go plummeting to your death. So Brabant arrives at the mountain just after he gets in there after the first fight, and he hands over from Commandant Griffith later in May, and he sets his mind to right straight away he's going to have a second crack at this. And it's like all things, failure will lead to success eventually. You just got to keep trying at it. And they learned some lessons from the first attack, and he launches his own attack on the 5th of June. And unfortunately, this one doesn't work either. It's probably a worse attempt than the first. They're repulsed. There's a lot of casualties laying out there in this open area. And the area that they were attacking across is probably the size of 2 tennis courts. So you've got this huge mountain in front of you, these tiers of defences in front of you, and you're crossing this open stone, almost bare stone front that's the size of 2 tennis courts. So when you're crossing that area, it's basically, as they coined it, you're running the gauntlet to get across this thing. And if you're laying out there wounded, you're not much hope of you being brought in. But there's a Surgeon Hartley out there working with Brabant, and he's all over the place bringing in the wounded, and he's awarded the Victoria Cross on Brabant's recommendation. So following that second attempt, Brabant, and this is when I was in the Cape Archives, I was finding these countless telegrams that he had sent as he send a dispatch rider out to Aliwal North, and they would send a telegram from there. So it was a pretty tedious communication with him. So I was finding telegrams and then written reports and recommendations from him, pleading for more troops. Excuse me. As he said, the only way they were going to crack this was with regulars, and the only ones available at the time was the um, the Cape Mounted Rifles. So just a reprint. The Cape Mounted Rifles, which were spread all across the frontier. Now, the Cape government didn't want to send them because the Zulu War was still playing out. The Pondamisi tribe, they believe that was tucked in sort of between Basuto land and Natal. Um, they believe that they could go into rebellion as well. So they just couldn't send everybody up there. And he kept dogging on about it, saying, you've got to send these troops up. And they were sending in burghers that were basically farmers that were press ganged into serving. And they were not much chop. There was mass desertions going on. And to put a cordon around this mountain, it was going to need thousands of troops. And it was like back in King Williamstown, where the headquarters was, the Cape Colonial Forces, they weren't really seeing it. And down in Cape Town, from the safety of the Cape Club, they definitely weren't seeing it, what was going on there. The terrain was treacherous. So the best he could, and with horses knocked up all the time, he put a cordon around the mountain, which almost every night the Baputhi were managing to get cattle through. And when you see this, you got no idea how they did this, but they managed to get the cattle up to the mountain. They were even bringing in other supplies. Fresh Baputhi were secured up in the mountain passes, were moving down to reinforce, and also some others were being moved out as well, almost to rest them. So he patrolled down along the Quithing River, where he knew that there was Moorosi had storage of grain, etc. He did a lot of patrolling down there, and this is really well covered in the book. And he talks about all these patrols and how they're bringing down these mountain guns. They're also using dynamite to blast some of the rebels out of tribes. So they're just not at the mountain, but there's rebels up in the little strongholds that they couldn't take on for any longer than probably about a 48-hour period, really.
Mm.
So he talks a lot about this, and it rolls on to September, October. They've endured a really bad winter down there at the mountain, and men are sick. As I said, there's sort of mass desertions. There's a lot of raiding going on, and finally somebody in the Cape government sort of realised there's something going on here. His whole supply chain was a mess. The way that he writes about that, especially his telegrams and stuff, is, he said it all needs to come under me. They subcontracted it out. So, several times subcontractor had been in a convoy of supplies and it would get raided. And then in the end, they didn't want to risk losing their wagons for this. So they're almost half starving up at the mountain as well. So in the end, Gordon Sprigg, this is the premier of the Prime Minister of the Cape, he comes up in person and he brings a strong delegation with him. And when he sees it himself, he realizes that they've got to do something, that Brabant's right. Now, in his writing in the book, he does sort of bang on a little bit about this, but in the end, they bring up a chap called Abe Bailey. So not Abe Bailey, Zach Bailey. And Zach Bailey had made his name in the Ninth Frontier War. He's an old Imperial officer as well, but he's commanding then the Cape Mounted Rifles, the new Cape Mounted Rifles that comes out of the paid for from the Cape Colonial coffers. So he comes up and he realizes that, yeah, they're right, we need to bring all the CM up there. So they quickly mobilize as many CMR that they safely could, and they get about 500 of them up to the mountain eventually. But Sprigg, who was actually had known Brabant for years, and he was the chap that wanted Brabant to get into politics to start off with. He said, "Do you want to hang around and lead this?" And Brabant said, "No, I'm done." The bulk of his regiment had been sent home anyway as CMR came in and other volunteer units came in as well. But he admits that he basically had a breakdown at that stage. He was suffering from insomnia. The stress of it all would become too much. But um, the one thing that he doesn't really put his hand up and say that I was right. And the Cape press get hold of this, and he gets a bit of a bad deal in the press. And they say that, later on when they finally take the mountain, as I said before, a setback and a failure usually ends to ultimate success. And it's like anything, this second attack, what they did glean out of that, they found a couple of access points, potential access points, where they could get ladders up the side of the mountain. So they had specially constructed ladders made, and Brabant had pointed that out. He said, "We think you can get up that." And when they finally took the mountain, it was a one-man front up a ladder and then scaling on rock. Now, I've been there and I don't know how they managed it. It's, you know, a, a climber would look at it and think, okay, that's going to be a little bit challenging. But they managed to get up on top of the mountain, one after the other, and they got about 300 CMR up there. And then they took the mountain with minutes. And now Zach Bailey moved up the top of that mountain wearing a deer stalker hat. He was pretty much wearing mufti as well, so like yellowy sort of coloured corduroy trousers, and he stood on the mountain. They raised the Union Jack, and that was the rebellion over. Bailey left that day, and he'd only been there, less than a month at that stage. But it was because of Brabant's recommendations, really, and he's banging on that you've got to do something and pointing out the access points that they took the mountain. But Bailey is the man of the moment, and he receives a CMG, Companion of Sir Michael and St. George, for it. They wrote poems about him. He was really the dude at the time. And as I said before, he had a good success in the Ninth Frontier War, so his name was really up there. But Brabant doesn't jump in the press and say, "Hey, it was me that paved the way for this," and the two failed attacks that fleshed out what we needed to do better next time. But that's the Moorosi Rebellion over, and this ran parallel to the Zulu War and beyond it.
Hmm.
And very few people know about it. It's a real epic and it's a fascinating subject. But he leaves with his first yeomanry, and they send everybody back home, and they lost a lot of men, leave the yeomanry, and he starts to recruit again. And then the next fight's looming, and that's the Basuto Gun War, and that's, in my mind, like the epic of all epics for the Cape government at that stage.
So what rank was he at this point?
But so yeah, he was a lieutenant colonel.
Right. And then, so as you say, so he's kind of as his career is tracking on, he's obviously having all of these kind of experiences, um, learning from his mistakes, as it were. And obviously we're seeing some of the qualities of that humility, um, and other things that we've mentioned. So yeah, so take us then into then the Basuto Gun War. What happens for him in that?
Yep. So the Basuto Gun War, it's just in size. I mean, it encompasses right up the north of Basuto land, and it goes all the way back down to the south. They fight in Moorosi's old territory again later in the war, and it goes into Griqualand East as well, and parts of the Transkei. So the size of geography, this thing is massive. And this comes about Gordon Spriggs um, pursuing, never-ending pursuing of disarming all the native tribes, whether they're loyal or been former rebels, of not only of rifles, but assegais as well. Um, so any weapons were to be taken off on them. And people like Brabant had said this is craziness. You know, as mentioned, Wolseley had said before, if you want to punch up with every tribe, go ahead and do this. This is just insane. And the Basuto were loyal to the crown. They were very industrious. They agriculture in Basuto land was on the rise. Um, but they could put in the field, and it was seen at one stage during the Gun War, 23,000 mounted Basuto together. So there was a little bit of infighting, and they, in as much as, yeah, okay, we should surrender the weapons, no, we should not surrender them. And at that stage, the Basuto were no real threat. Some people had said before that if you pushed them, they could be a greater threat than the Zulu because they're mounted, they've got more firearms, yeah, and modern firearms as well. They were better equipped than the Cape Colonial government because they were working up in. They sent young men were off working up in the Kimberley diamond mines as well, and so when they came out all cashed up with their coin, they'd buy a firearm, and it was more a status thing, really, getting the latest car. You know, that's really more than a weapon, and they were seldom used. And one magistrate had said it's been months since he's seen a rifle. So what are we talking about here? Disarm them. They're just tucked away in their houses, you know, their homes. But anyway, so there's a lot of posturing, and the Basuto are refusing to do this. The CMR moved up an element of the CMR. It's broken into two wings at that stage. So Zach Bailey takes up an element up to the north in the Basuto land, and pretty soon that there's a fight. A fight breaks out, and a chap called Carrington, Fred Carrington, who was formerly of the 24th Foot, he was seconded to the Cape Mounted Rifles. He's a lieutenant colonel. Fred Carrington had got into Mafeteng where they become besieged, and there's a general rebellion breaks out, and there's sieges all up and down Basuto land where magisterial officers are under siege of the Basuto, and they're mounted. So it's a different enemy you're fighting here. And just quickly, I should say that the way that they fought in the war is they didn't adopt the tactics of the Zulu. They tended to preserve life. They, in as much as that they're going to draw the enemy in onto ground where they want to fight, and they're not going to. There's going to be no pitched battle to the bitter end. There's going to be no Alundi, no Izandwana. They just can't see the point in wasting life nor property. And so when the first yeomanry are mobilised and sent to the field, so they're in it. Mobilisation would have been then about, let me just think, yeah, early October in 1880. They're mobilising, and we've got Brabant is sent up to Vepina, in the Orange Free State, and they're hard up against the border there. There's a little farm known as Mason's Farm, and British General Mansfield Clark, a Zulu War veteran, he was a 58th Foot chap. He's made a local brigadier general. He's sent up there to command the relief column and conduct the operations in Basuto land. So at this stage, they're mobilising the colonial forces, of which at one point there's 17,000 of them in the field, in Basuto land, rebellion breaks out in the Transkei and East Griqualand as well with other tribes. The Tembu, the Pondomisi enter into rebellion. So this thing's massive. There's more sieges going on than you can count. They seem to pop up everywhere, and there's lagers formed in Tata, down in the Transkei, to Solo. There's a little magisterial office under siege. Maclear's under an epic siege. They go down to the last 3 rounds when they're relieved after like something like 70 days. It's an epic story, but getting to Brabant's little piece of it, so they're at Mason's Farm, and they form a large column under Mansfield Clark, and they cross the border into Basuto land, and they should be at Mafeking in probably about 4 or 5 hours march. It's just short distance across the border, and as they're moving, they're moving in this huge mobile square, very similar to what Chelmsford had done on his approach to Ulundi the previous year. So as they're moving in that day, Brabant's the field officer with Mansfield Clark. He's pretty much his deputy for the whole operation. And as they're marching in, they've got scouts going ahead, securing all the high ground that's along this road, to the left and right of them. And they hit this, or they see this feature coming up in front of them. At the time, they probably wouldn't have known the name of it because they were devoid of maps at the time. Any maps that they had and that I've ever found are more diagrammatic than anything from memory. So the zero surveyed maps or anything like that at the time anyway. So it's just relying on scouts, but they see this sort of prominent feature ahead of them. Put it in context for people who are familiar with the Zulu War, it's probably about half the size of Isandlwana. And it's known as Calabani Mountain. And as they're approaching, Brabant's right up the front of the column with Mansfield Clark, and off to the left rear, his first yeomanry that was under Dalgetty, his adjutant at the time. They go to secure some high ground, but as they're approaching it, rather than moving up onto the high ground and looking to seeing what's over the other side, they dismount a couple of troops just in front of it, and the guys are moving up, and the Basuto looking for opportunity anywhere that they can. This is the way they operate. They're not going to pounce until they get the opportunity. They really bide their time. They show great discipline here. They come charging mounted on their ponies over the crest, and they're wielding their battle axes. They got firearms, and in minutes, 32 of the first yeomanry are killed and 10 are mortally wounded. So these people are really badly cut up. Very few men came out of that even lightly wounded, and this is just in minutes. And what a bad start to this campaign. This is a real setback. Now, Brabant's up front, and he's not really aware of, he knows the movement's going on, and he hears some fighting, but at the time he doesn't know it's his men. It's his regiment. And it's later that a Captain Nettleton comes cantering up to him with tears streaming down his face, my troops being cut up. And so they have to push on. They quickly bring in the bodies. They throw them into a cart. And as they're relieving Mafeking, where Fred Carrington had been besieged and fighting for some time, they obviously heard the firing, because it's not far away. It's just a few miles down the road. They could hear this firing going on. But they said, although they had been relieved, it was quite a somber experience, because they're bringing in a wagon load of dead and they're going straight into a burial service. And Carrington and his boys have been eating horses. They're running out of food, and so they were half starving. I think Brabant says they offered us some horse meat, but we declined the offer. Nobody really felt like eating anyway that day. So they relieved Mafeking. And from that point on, um, it's a series of patrolling out of Mafeking. They need to show that they're advancing, so they set up a camp about 10 miles north. And it's sort of like ends up becoming a bit of a mud sodden affair, and they move to another camp. But every time that they go out and attack, like the paramount chief fighting in that area is a chap called Leratoli. He's really the best chief that they've got at the time. He's a grandson of Mesheshwe and very, very charismatic character as well. A tough fighter, really knows what he's doing. But within a couple of days of being in Mafeking, Clark wants to show that he's making progress, and he goes out and attacks what would the area known as Leratoli's village. And it's after this attack they take it, but they can't hold it. They haven't got the resources to hold this at all. So they go out and Brabant's involved with that fight, and they lose a lot of men. And then the Basuto they'd fought, they move back, they let them take the area, they can't hold it, and this just goes on for the entire campaign. There's pitch fight after fight. They're out on patrol, then they're having to form square, they're having to repel mounted charges, and this just goes on, and it's not going to go anywhere because the fighting style of the Basuto won't allow them to have a conclusive Ulundi moment. There's going to be no decisive battle here, and this could go on for years. And we see it play out that way in the Second Boer War, the way that the Boers fought. They fight when they want to fight. They preserve life. But at the end of the day, whilst that tactic was sort of playing out well for the Basuto, they're making a fool of the Cape government. They were almost sending them bankrupt, as the Moorosi rebellion had pretty much done. They they really wanted to get their crops planted, and that wasn't going to happen if this war was going on. So there's an armistice, and Brabant describes the experience of the armistice. He just talks about all of this in his account, and it's fascinating read. But he said very next day they're all best of friends. One of the chiefs comes in and he said before he wants to go, he wants to secure a Basuto pony or two, I think. And he said, well, this young Basuto chief who fought a major part in the war, and he said he was a very impressive character. And he says, well, what do you want? He said, well, I want a dress uniform. And he said, okay, well, I'll give you my yeomanry dress uniform then. And they did this exchange, and it's just bizarre how they're at each other, and they fought these pitched battles that um, mostly the outside world really weren't aware of.
Hmm.
The Zulu War still was overshadowing it. That still had grabbed everybody's imagination. But yeah, so the yeomanry they leave in June 1881. They march out, and then it's decided that the yeomanry that were known as Sprig's Pets, they're named after Gordon Sprigg, the Prime Minister, was a failed enterprise, and they disband them, which is quite sad considering they really started to get it all together. They were uniformed then. They were fighting reasonably well.
Hmm.
Um, but yeah, the gun war there it is, and Brabant was right in amongst it. He led patrols and columns throughout. He was present when Surgeon McRae performed the deeds that was later resulting in him to be received the Victoria Cross. So he had a hand in Hartley and Hartley's VC in 79 at Moorosi's Mountain, and also McRae's as well, who was a yeomanry surgeon. And so that brings the gun war to an end, and then you sort of get this period of peace for a number of years, and then he throws himself into his farming and getting back into politics.
Yeah, so I mean, I'm conscious of time. You've given really like detailed accounts of of the Basuto Gun War, which I think, as you say, is overshadowed by the Zulu War, but equally as fascinating, really, and particularly I think the contrast of perhaps how the military units are formed. That you've got these kind of almost I say yeomanry groups, these kind of semi-professionals, compared to obviously in the Zulu War, you've got maybe the more established kind of British forces going up against the tribes, and very kind of contrasting approaches, tactics. And it's interesting to hear how it all kind of links together in the political landscape of obviously Southern Africa.
Yeah, yeah, it's all tied together. And not many people realise that as the Zulu War was playing out, the Cape government are mobilising regiments to back up the Imperials. That all this was going on, and when you think about the effort just for the Zulu War was massive, and same was up in the Transvaal as well.
Mm,
The Transvaal volunteers, there was a lot going on up there, and right out of Kimberley regiments were being formed to go and serve in the Transvaal during the Zulu War.
mm.
All a part of the greater effort. We tended to zoom in and focus on what was happening around Isandlwana and Rorke's Drift and what was happening with Woods Number 4 column and so on. But yeah, it all goes all the way back down to Cape Town and as far out to Kimberley and up to Pretoria as well.
Definitely. So obviously Brabant, we'll kind of just mention obviously he's involved in the Second Anglo-Boer War, which is covered in the book, and then
Yep.
following that, he gets command of the Colonial Division. So that's I guess towards the end of his career. So probably take us from there. That how does he get command of the Colonial Division, and then through to the
Yeah.
twilight years of his career as such.
Yep. So he did this period of in politics. This sort of leads to it. So he's a member of the Legislative Assembly in the Cape from 73 to 78, then 84 to 1902. And during that tenure, the politics is really changing. The first Boer War had played out, the Transvaal had got their independence. And ever since then, there amongst the Afrikaners in the Cape in particular, there was a movement, and Brabant talks about this. There's this vision of a united South Africa that would operate under the lines of way that the Transvaal government was operating. And then, of course, you have the Jameson raid with Cecil Rhodes and Leander Starr Jameson, who Brabant knew personally, and he writes about them at the time. I mean, he writes of Rhodes in real glowing terms. I mean, he says he believes he was the greatest living Englishman ever, and he wrote this in 1902. And he really admired him, despite the world seems to think of old Cecil at this point in time. So the politics was changing, and he was always sort of saying that the colony is not defended well enough. And he knows this because he's an old military man. He's, you know, been a colonel of yeomanry. He's fought in a couple of wars. And then when the Jameson raid happens in over the sort of like December New Year period of 1895, 96, when that plays out, he talks about it in his book, and he says, I remember where I was when this happened. And this is a huge thing. This is basically a coup d'etat of the Transvaal.
Mm,
You had the outland, the Uitlanders, as they called them, in all the foreigners in Johannesburg that were wanting to take over control of the Rand. They were debating on what flag to use. They didn't want to have it to be a British flag, though, because there were a lot of foreigners, Germans, etc., involved with it, some Americans involved with this. But Jameson, to support this alleged plea for help, which was all just really fabricated letter, raided across the border with 500 Mashonaland and Matabeleland mounted police that they brought down out of Rhodesia. And it all comes to a grinding halt just out of Johannesburg, and it's a failure. But as news spread of the raid and where Jameson was, the full news of how it played out against Jameson hadn't been realised, and so Brabant talks about he's in East London at the time, and men are going, right, well, we've got to, they could count of 1,000 men that could ride to his assistance, but nobody had thought about how they're going to arm them, etc. Some of the volunteer regiments were even in the Cape were starting to say, well, let's mobilise and we'll go. And then they realise it's a failure. But the politics after that, the the Afrikaners, the Cape, the pulling away from the Cape government, that desire become greater and greater in a lot of elements. And then you're seeing political parties forming, that the Afrikaner Bond that's forming, and then Brabant and others, they form this South African League in 97, of which Rhodes becomes the president. And then eventually the nexus between the Boers and the Brits is too much, and the war breaks out. And as war breaks out, Brabant never thought that he was going to be jumping back in the saddle again. And they use his influence along the Eastern Cape to start raising regiments. Before the war, he'd even assisted in giving advice on how to raise a protectorate regiment, which was then shut up and besieged in Mafeking. He sets to raising, at the request of the government, two regiments. One regiment became in two wings, and they call that Brabant's Horse, the first and second regiment. So he forms them, and then they realise to evict the Boers out of the Cape government, they're going to need a larger force, and pretty much there's a 3,000 men that they decide they're going to put under one hat, and they call it the Colonial Division. Now, Brabant didn't want to take command of the regiment, but he was pushed firstly by the families of those that had joined Brabant's Horse, which is about 1,600 men in both units, and the men themselves, that you're going to come with us. So he's still got a good reputation. Anyway, so he takes the field, and they make him a local brigadier general, and he commands the Colonial Division, which forms part of the remainder of the British Army in the Cape, with basically the mission to evict the Boers from the Cape. And then they eventually push on into the Free State, and the capitals are taken. And so he serves with them from basically in the field from January to April 1900. During this period, they fight at Dordrecht, which for the Cape government was really good to see that Cape town of Dordrecht is taken back from the Boers, and there's quite a serious fight out there, and he writes about that in the book, that fight. He also talks, good to see, he talks about the life on the veldt at the time, how miserable the weather is and what they're going through at the time. So you get a really good insight that life in the Colonial Division is not all a bed of roses. There's a lot of fighting, there's a lot of patrolling going on, and the weather's really bad. And at some stage, they're out there without their patrol tents, etc. And eventually they evict the Boers from the Cape. They come back later on, though, of course, later in the war. He has about 1,800 men under Dalgetty. So Dalgetty, who'd served with him in the Frontier Mounted Rifles and then also in the 1st Yeomanry, is at that stage commanding the Cape Mounted Rifles, and is a colonel. And so Brabant is ordered to send Dalgetty and 1,800 men down to Vepina, of which those that had served in the gun war knew quite well. And the mission there is to hold the bridge, and that's nestled right in on the Basuto land border, and it's the Jammersburg Drift Bridge. The Holden Christian de Wet is that well-known Boer commander general who stays in the field until the end of the war, and he was just completely elusive to the British columns. He ends up besieging Dalgety at Vepina, and he ends up with, at some stage, with about 11,000 Boers besieging them there. And it's from the period of this is in April, so we're looking between 9th and 24th of April that Dalgety and his 1,800 men of the Colonial Division are besieged there. Brabant wants to make a dash to go in and relieve them, but he stopped and told no, it's not a good move, and he writes it. Yeah, it was in hindsight, it was a foolish idea, but he wanted to ride to save his men. So they end up getting a lot of reinforcements. General Fitzroy Hart ended up bringing a brigade in. General Rundle's got his divisions, and then eventually they were never going to capitulate at Jammersburg Drift. They just weren't cut like that. They weren't going to surrender. Although they were starving, they were running low on ammunition. They were of talk within themselves of reducing their perimeter, but they weren't going to surrender, and they knew that eventually that the Brits would outweigh them, the Boers in numbers, and the Boers would evaporate and live to fight again another day. And so that's what's happened. Dalgety's relieved, but in the press, Cape press at the time, it's a real big deal that the Colonial Division's done this, and they don't call it the Siege of Epina in the press. It's called Jammersburg Drift. That's how they referred to it as. But it really only becomes known as Vepina later because of the battle class to the Queen's South Africa Medal, which in itself is quite an honour to get that, and it's awarded to the Colonial Division. So Brabant at the time, he's highly thought of. Roberts wrote of him in later on as he's being knighted. So he's knighted in April 1901, and he left the Colonial Division at that stage. But he said, Colonel Brabant's a fine leader of men. He represents the true imperial feeling in the Cape, and aided by his fellow colonists, has furnished the object lesson in loyalty and devotion to the Crown. So that's not really only Brabant, that's everybody in the Colonial Division. The way that they pulled that division together and they set to the field, and they went through everything they could. Now, Brabant's division, it must be said that they didn't always have a great reputation. At times there was a little bit of farm looting going on, but however, Brabant sort of writes in his book that every farm that they were pretty much coming across had been looted by the Boers on the way out in some of the towns, etc. So it was a bit hard to keep his men at check at time. I think the Boers called them Brabant's Bambiti or something like that, they called them. So he gets promoted to Major General, 22nd of August 1902, and he's just led the colonial contingent to King Edward's coronation as well. So this is quite an honour, really, that the first in colonial history that he's given divisional command for South African Colonial Division. I always look at it, it's a bit akin like Curry and Monash being given command of the Canadians Corps and the Australian Corps in the Great War. So Brabant is quite a big deal in the Cape at the time. He's a Commandant General of the Cape Colonial Forces. It's obviously a permanent role, which he holds from 1903 to 1904. So he takes the Cape Colonial Forces through this post-Boer War transition. So the war ended on the 31st of May 1902. And so he's taken them through this transitional stage where they're looking at the next war and how they would fight it, mobility, how that had paid out in the Boer War, that the need to have more mounted infantry. So he takes them through that period, and then he finally retires. It's like enough's enough of soldiering, and then he goes back into politics again, which he has another short tenure as a in the Legislative Assembly from 1904 to 1907. And it's at this time he writes the manuscript um, on a trip to London on the voyage. He writes that, and then he gets into he lives until 13th of December 1914 when he dies. Needless to say, being in politics and some of the trying experiences took a toll on his life,
Mm.
as it did for a lot of men. His right-hand man, Dalgetty, actually died. He went back home to the UK. He was a Brit and decided he was going to retire in the UK. He died in London a couple of months before Brabant did. So Brabant got to see the opening months of the Great War and would have been reading in the press how that would have played out, but unfortunately, we don't know his opinions at the time. Um, so yeah,
That's
that's the
Brabant,
story
isn't
of
it?
General Brabant. But it must be said at the time, but in the colony of Natal, parallel to this, at the same time of being promoted to Major General and knighted, um, there's Dartnell, who we know back to the Zulu War days, and his career goes back to the Indian Mutiny
Mm.
days, and he'd settled in Natal, and so in Natal it was Dartnell, and in the Cape Colony it was Brabant.
Yeah, certainly a life well lived, so it seems. Certainly, some of the experiences, and it's so fortunate that he did take that opportunity on the voyage to London to obviously set it down on paper. And I guess perhaps fortunate for yourself and for Barnthorne that it hasn't been published before, and remarkable that it was just sat there,
Yeah,
and, waiting for you to find it as such.
yeah, it's a yeah, fascinating and great read. I mean, the document has been known, it was known to be in the archives, but yet nobody had published it yet. So it's fascinating, and I I like the way that he writes about his earlier life as well. That was great to get that insight, and you can just picture that young Brabant joining the militia age 15,
Hmm.
and then going through that prickly first phase in the under Lord Chelmsford when he was known as Thesiger then, and sort of ballsing up his first drive for him, and but redeeming himself to command this Colonial Division.
And I guess it's worth pointing out. So while the original manuscript is was in his own hand, kind of your role in proceedings is to try and fill in the gaps. So adding that extra
Yeah,
detail to the story just to make it clear, in certain cases who certain people were, where it links to other events that are going on. So you've spent a great deal of time kind of reading between the lines, literally, and
yeah.
bringing it to this kind of fuller conclusion. I think that's fair to say.
Yeah. That's right. I mean, there's like what close to 300 footnotes in there explaining who. So everybody that is mentioned in it, I've footnoted. A couple of people, a couple of politicians were a bit difficult to pin down because there was several by the same name. He doesn't mention their first name, but every officer in there, I pen out from sort of cradle to the grave their military career. Every soldier he mentions, politicians, even some of the native chiefs I've penned in their exploits that they did. So, and then also expanding further in the footnotes on all that extra detail
Mm.
to pull the context together. Somebody that read it in 1902 would say, "Oh, yeah, I know what he's talking about," but now some of it is just lost to us. But I've done the best effort I could to piece it all together, and the chapters we had sort of um, I think they're well laid out and they flow chronologically. It's yeah, the additional information, some of it I dug out of the Cape archives, I've thrown in the footnotes as well.
Hmm.
Some of the dates and places I've had to put in brackets to explain fully, in my where exactly where it is and the date, just to be clear. I
Yeah.
think he did a good job. Um, I think there was even some of the dates of one of the patrols in the Moorosi campaign. I was lucky enough to find the war diary for the artillery troop of the CMR, which is a blow-by-blow daily record of troops in and out, where they're doing, ammunition fired,
Hmm.
and all the ins and outs of keeping a troop in the field. And Brabant's dates and that war diary's dates are out by a day. They're slightly skew with, so I think he did a pretty good job. I ended up went with the war diary dates because I've corroborated that with some other sources as well. So him thinking back, I don't know what resources he had to whether he had some old notes himself or a diary that has been lost to time.
Hmm.
But he's pretty much got it right.
Yeah. And you've done as I say, you've done a great job in your part in his story as such. So I guess just to close off is we like to ask our authors what's next. I know you've alluded to other projects going on. So yeah, what's next for Cam Simpson?
Yeah, so the Moorosi rebellion book, that that's pretty much concluded. Just sort of working on some maps and stuff like that now, which I actually need to have a quick chat with you guys about. Um, that's really finalised and concluded. I've actually got a couple of a bit of edits going on at the moment. That's finished. Then I've got the gun war book to sort of pull together. But parallel to that, I talked earlier on, I've got these sort of pallets of biographies going. I've got about 600 pages of all the Zulu War officers, whether they're imperial or colonial. Um, that little piece of work I'm really, really proud of, because especially on the colonials that are so difficult to research. I mean, that's probably in there a culmination of 20 years plus of nerdily keeping every little bit of information on somebody. And that was a great thing of being the Cape Archives. You were digging in, getting into some of these colonials' lives and stuff. And the Imperials are also great and exciting. They go off and do amazing things. Um, and yet you find people ending up in the weirdest places. There's one chap who dies in Butte, Montana. Um, Another Imperial officer, I think he's in the 58th Regiment. Um, he's inducted into the Cowboy Hall of Fame, and he's like, is a chap that fought at Majuba Hill was his last fight, and people come out here to Australia, and it's amazing how they ended up, and plenty of them, more than what we think, ended up serving in the Great War.
Mm.
Um, yeah, I was going to do a Substack article on them, and there's that, and then the Jamison Raiders. That was a book I started long before any of this. And that was because I love my biographies. My book on the Frontier Light Horse, it's loaded with everybody's biographies, everybody in the regiment, the tail-mounted rifles, the same. The Jamison raid, everybody that crossed the border with Jamison, I've researched from the cradle to the grave. And as I mentioned, I'd really needed to get into the Zimbabwe archives to get into the records of the old Mashonaland and Matabeleland Matter police, and get all their promotion dates and stuff like that. So that's pulled together, but that's in the back of my mind. And that book gets opened up for a few minutes every week as I try to tweak a few things, or I see another little bit of information just to close off some biographies. But that one's there, and that's quite an exciting piece. But that's also about 600 pages or something like that. So it's a big one.
Oh,
But
you definitely got
it's
your
got it.
You've
It's
definitely
it's
got your
got it's
hands
got to
full there,
come.
haven't you?
Yeah, it's got to come to an end, that one, that's for sure. But and there's so they're the big ones that I've got going, and so sort of also sort of keep write a lot of Substack articles. I've mentioned, earlier on, for Chris Parkinson, I've written up scripts for him, and we've done stuff together
Mm.
as well. So that sort of keeps me busy. But Moorosi's, I've got to admit, I'm really proud of that, because that campaign is not covered from the start to beginning, save maybe a chapter in the odd book, or a paragraph here and there. It's but it's huge, and it's really exciting stuff. But it's almost, I'm not going to say it's an official history, but I've got that much detail in it because I thought if nobody else does it, at least it's all going to be parked in one spot. So whilst the main narratives there about the book and the appendices, I've thrown in all the battle casualties, and even some stuff about when they got pensions, etc. All the honours and awards, and even those that received a monetary reward, which was the mechanism for rewarding men in the Cape Mounted Rifles at the time. So they get a £5 bonus for, bravery that day. But the idea, I think, when they formed the regiment, because they're also policemen, was if they did a bit of good policing work, they'd get a bonus. But yes, I found all those little tidbits in there, and also a synopsis of all the units that served in the war. Not all of them received the South African War Medal, which I realised. The units served there, and they did not get, not one man got a medal at all. Some of the burger contingents, one or two of the volunteer units, for whatever reason,
Mm.
they I think it was down to the commanders really at the time to submit roles, and those men have moved on with their life, and if they were still alive at the time, didn't happen. So, and I've listed out all the officers, and I've cross-referenced anybody to previous campaigns to, if they're not mentioned in the main text, where I'd write a man had served in the Indian Mutiny, etc., or the Frontier War, I'll put that in. So you get a little, it'd be like Captain Fred Bloggs, formerly Frontier Mounted Rifles, Sergeant Major, etc. Um, one or two Zulu War veterans made their way down to Moorosi's as well, but only a small group. So yeah, that's what I'm really proud of, and the gun war, I think, will surpass that.
Yeah, definitely look forward to reading both in good time. So, well, thank you so much. I think, yeah, definitely, I've learned a lot. I've, obviously having read the book already, but even now talking about some of these other projects and how it all links together in the tapestry of the history. So yeah, thank you again. And a reminder to anyone watching, so if you'd like to purchase Frontier Warrior, please visit our website, which is www.barnformpublishing.co.uk, or indeed it's available on Amazon. So yeah, thank you very much.